All right, so what would societal collapse actually look like? And can anything be gleaned from what is currently happening in the Gaza Strip? How would the deterioration of the critical infrastructure that sustains human life right now play into our social psychology? Well, now we have a case study in the Gaza Strip from which we can extrapolate to our own societies. And what we're going to be doing today is doing a demographic deep dive between these two societies to compare exactly what the difference is going to be. And I'm going to be showing you some footage of looting, as it's called. Here we wouldn't even probably call this looting, but in the Gaza Strip they're calling it looting of these supply trucks, because obviously supplies have run incredibly thin there. And we are going to hypothesize about how exactly this same scenario would play out here. Now, before we do that, let's just take a quick look at the headlines right now. We have a large convoy of military vehicles headed towards the Lebanese border. This is Israeli military vehicles. It appears to be Merkava tanks on the backs of flatbed trucks. They are getting ready for a looming war with Hezbollah that seems all but written in stone at this point. However, there have been a few noteworthy moments over the last 24 hours that are positive. One is a potential prisoner exchange or hostage exchange between Hamas and Israel, as well as hopefully the initiation of some sort of rapprochement with Xi Jinping and Joe Biden when they meet this week. We do, however, also have a level 1 security event that is going to be taking place in Washington, D.C. They're concerned because there's a pro-Israeli march that's going to be taking place there, which of course is a high potential for terrorist incidents, I presume, or just lower intensity civil unrest. We have, of course, the continued concentration of U.S. military firepower in the Middle East. There's been some new maps that have come out, and of course, I'm going to be sharing that with you today, as well as talking about some of the recent attacks on American military bases and the retaliatory strikes that were conducted, as well as other things. But first, let's just take a look at some footage here of what is considered looting in the Gaza Strip. Now, as you probably know, the Gaza Strip, there's no fuel, okay? There's no food, there's no water, there's no electricity, there's no comms, there's no medicine, there's no shelter, there's no safety, and there is very little logistics. People have reverted to using horse and carriage in a lot of places. Now, I say there's none of those things. Obviously, there are those things, but in greatly restricted and limited amounts. So when these supply trucks come in, it's basically every man for himself. I imagine if a similar situation unfolded in our society, we would see much more chaotic scenes because, of course, everybody here is armed. Most people in Gaza, besides Hamas, are not armed. So that at least, in the very least, makes for more peaceful looting, if you will. And to me, I don't even consider this type of thing looting. People, this free-for-all, getting whatever you can off the truck, this is just survival. As soon as you see a couple people doing it, it's almost the onus is on you to actually follow in suit, or else, you're just going to be left with nothing. So the fact that they're not burning the place down, the fact that it hasn't reverted to cannibalism, a variety of different things that we would likely see in our society where there's less social cohesion, there's less of a collectivist mentality, it's more heterogeneous. There they have cultural homogeneity, they have religious homogeneity, they have racial homogeneity. So these are all protective factors against the devolution into societal chaos, which is not to say they're not going to have their share of chaos, okay? Things are going to be chaotic there. However, these are also what we're seeing in a lot of the imagery that's coming out of there. We're seeing a lot of self-sacrificing behavior, people putting themselves at immense amounts of risk to dig people out of the rubble. I'm just not so confident that you would see things like that here, especially when the supply lines ran dry. We have a much more guarded approach in this individualistic Western society. Now, this might not be the case in every place. In certain neighborhoods, this is going to be different. But if you're living in an urban environment where you don't know your neighbors, where people are living on top, where there's a high population density, a low access to resources, and everybody has their own individual concept of what identity is and what gender is and what race is and all these other things, then that sort of melting pot, I'm guessing, is going to be a lot more chaotic. You know, I used to have a saying that I used to say on the channel a lot. I haven't said it in many years, but it's much farther and much longer to fall from the penthouse. And what I meant by that was the people who are living high on the hog, the rich people, the people who, you know, enjoy a lot more amenities than the rest of us, who have the ability to indulge in all manner of decadence that society offers. When shit hits the fan, and when those zeros, ones and zeros in the bank, and those commas in the bank mean nothing, those people are going to have a harder time to adapt, okay? People who are closer to the bottom floor, to the basement, there's less distance for them to fall. And it's an interesting metaphor, especially when you look at Western societies versus third world societies who are already on the brink. Most people are living under the poverty line. SHTF is really just another day. It's one step down from that. Whereas in Western society, it's a massive leap down. In fact, most people, I would say, you know, a good example is, you know, the proverbial guy who jumps out the window because, you know, the stock market crashes. You know, he's still alive. He's not, okay, maybe he's bankrupt, but he still lives in a first world. It doesn't matter. He jumps out of the window anyways, right? So it's just that relativity thing. People are not going to be able to adapt to such a major shift and downgrade in their standard of living. The people in Gaza they struggle from day one. Okay, let's talk about some of the demographics here. So the average age is 18 years old. The average age here is much older. And as the saying goes, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And I would say with an average age of around 40 years old in North America, you know, people are more stubborn, they're more set in their ways, they have less neuroplasticity, is the scientific term for your ability to neurologically adapt to a changing environment. Whereas young people, they're just more adaptable, they're more resilient. So the youthful nature of the Gazan society gives them a bit of an advantage in these types of situations. Now, I'm not saying that there's not going to be problems there and there's not going to be certain protective factors here. Obviously, this is a very unique situation, and I think it would be different if there were no aid trucks coming in. Now, and this is kind of the experiment that we're seeing. Even if they're getting 200 aid trucks a day, that's only a sustainment level, barely a sustainment level. And that presumes they have the logistics to evenly distribute all of this food. Right now, what we're seeing is a very Darwinian thing taking place here. And this is really physically natural selection, what is happening here, because the people who are fastest, the people who are strongest, are going to make it to the supply truck. Wherever these supply trucks come in, I'm sure they're not making it too far from the border before they get ransacked. There's trying to, I'm sure Hamas or whoever is coordinating what's going on in the Gaza Strip is trying to coordinate this to the best of their capability. But what we are seeing happening here is natural selection, okay? And so the people who are farthest away from these trucks, the people who are farther from the Rafah border, you know, they all have to converge on this place if they do want supplies. So, you know, I guess we're going to see exactly how things play out in that respect, but there's a lot to consider here. Now, if there were no supply trucks, then of course this would be an experiment in, I guess, just resilience in terms of, you know, how long they were able to go before it descended into complete lawlessness and people stealing food from one another. I'm sure it's already happening in a lot of cases. Of course, we know, and this sounds crazy to even think about, but historically there have been instances of cannibalism throughout history. I'm not saying they're close to that yet. I don't think the international community would allow it to. I think there's too much attention being paid to it. I think if that were to be something that was happening, then we would see the protests double in size if that was the case. So I don't foresee that happening. But if something like this were to happen on a global scale, and understand that they have many more protective factors than we do, okay? They weren't birthed with this attitude of entitlement. They're all constantly living in a state of post-traumatic stress, okay? So every day they're seeing death, they're experiencing grief, they're experiencing loss. Most people in Western society, and this is not throwing shade on people in our society, it's just a fact. We're not accustomed to grief and loss. When we lose something, it's typically quite rare. If we suffer some sort of injury, it's rare. We can go to the hospital. We can get it figured out right away. It's usually not a big deal. The challenges, the first world problems that we encounter aren't really that acute. They're not serious issues, okay? So they are accustomed to death and loss. And I would also say that they have an intuitive acuity about them, more of a street smarts that you have to develop, especially when you live under the gun in this open air style prison like they do. So they're really getting Mad Max and dystopia in one, because they're living under constant threat of bombardment. They never know when their building is going to be blown up. They don't know if their building is being used by Hamas and it's going to be targeted by Israelis. So you're living under that constant, chronic state of stress, okay? You're living under constant deprivation from food, fuel, water, toxic water, which is probably not that good because the water work system is likely contaminated in a lot of ways, if not completely functioning. You're dealing with a lot of sanitary issues, healthcare issues, obviously. Healthcare is inaccessible in most places, but waterborne pathogens are going to be a thing. You're dealing with a situation where you probably don't have a lot of electricity. You don't have a means of cleaning your clothes, so personal hygiene becomes a factor. You don't have communications. In many cases, you don't have the internet, and if you do, it's probably not a fast connection. I don't even know how people there are connecting to the internet, paying their bills type thing. Shelter is obviously another factor. Shelter in this context would be about safety and security. And then, of course, the simple factor of logistics, the fact that it's just complete chaos in the streets. You probably have a lot of cars that have just run out of gas. You have horses that are being utilized by many people. And all of these things under the protective element of trying to prevent thieves, prevent crime from unfolding, and all of these things would be a very challenging situation. Now, you also have religious homogeneity. Let's just take a look at another video while we're watching this here. So this is another video of a truck which was raided right across the Rafah border, and they were complaining that the food was expired, even though you could see on it that it wasn't going to expire for another week. And even if it did, food expiration dates are just Best By dates. They're not actual expiration dates. So they were complaining about that, which I found kind of strange. I have noticed in some of the, obviously people there in that society, they're going to be very cynical, and they're probably, there's a lot, it's a young population, so teenagers are going to teenager. So, that's something that you kind of have to make an exception for, that, a lot of this kind of rebelliousness is just what you're going to see in any society with teenagers. But then that's amplified by the fact that, they are living in very dire situations. So a lot of it's justified. But what I found is that, so this is a religiously homogeneous society. There is a small Christian minority. But in America, you have so many different religions, so many different sects, so many different and sexes as well, because of course, LGBTQ 4+1 R2D2. I don't know what the hell it is even is anymore. Anyways, you know what I mean. We have racial heterogeneity. We have just even the degrees in separation in terms of wealth distribution are far more pronounced here. So there's just a lot more variability, and that means that there's a lot more conflict. That means that people aren't all on a level playing field, which would make this sort of situation much, much worse here, I do believe. And then, of course, you have the issue of gangs. Now, at least with Hamas, and at least with the street justice that I presume Hamas brings to this environment, you actually probably have more or less lawlessness than you would in a city where you're trying to govern it with a centralized police force, because of a variety of reasons that I'm not going to get into. But I think with the presence of crime syndicates here in the West, and just the self-interested nature of an individualistic society, you're likely to see a lot more crime. You're likely to see a lot less sharing behavior, especially when times get tough. You also, in our society, have a much greater prevalence of drug addiction, I presume. Now, there is a couple drugs that they make on the street there, but because it's a very strict Sunni population for the most part, so they say alcohol and drugs are frowned upon culturally, so it's not something that is embraced as it is here. Smoking marijuana and stuff like that is very culturally accepted in Western societies. Not so much there. So that would be a protective factor. That will create a lot of problems here. People just trying to get their fix when the shit hits the fan. Not only that, prescription drugs. So when people are coming off of psychoactive substances that are prescribed, it's almost just as bad as coming off of an illegal narcotic, if not worse. Okay, people can get very depressed, they can get very anxious, they can get very hyperactive. Take all of the symptoms that those medications alleviate, flip it, and then multiply it by 10, and that's what the withdrawal effects are going to be. People are going to be losing their freaking minds, and unfortunately, like I said, because I am a proud gun owner, but a lot of people are armed here, so we're going to see, just school shootings on a widespread level because everybody's going to be off the meds that they were given to keep them stable, and in many cases probably contributed to the problem. But that's a debate that we're not going to have today, just something to think about. But the average age of Gaza is definitely something worth noting. The fact that these are all 18-year-olds, and I mean, that's the average age is 18, and they're getting along this well, is saying something, because we know exactly how this would play out in our society, right? This would be a chaotic situation. People loot for much less here. People loot on Black Fridays, okay? People loot for Nike shoes. People loot for liquor. People loot for video games, television sets. Just wait until there's that desperation of food. People aren't going to give a shit. And as soon as those grocery stores are cleared out, they're going to start moving up the supply chain to the higher hanging fruit. They're first going to go to the distribution centers, then they're going to go to the train yards, then they're going to go to the actual grain silos, and then to the farmers' fields. And before you know it, they're going to be poaching farmers' cows, and then they're going to be headhunting humans when the four-legged meat runs out. As I said, they have a more collectivist mindset. They are more adapted to struggle. I mean, what's the worst that you've had to struggle with? I'm sure there's some people who are over 40, they remember the dirty 80s and the dirty 1970s, and things were tough, bologna sandwiches, and, we all went through that, shitty era of the 80s and the 70s, most people anyways, where people were just generally poor back then. Like maybe I shouldn't say everybody, but there was a lot of us who were, okay? So, but that's not the struggle I'm talking about. I'm talking about seeing your friend blown apart. I'm talking about living every single day not knowing if it's going to be your last, not having any possible opportunities. That makes for a hardy group of people, okay? So this is something we don't have in our society. We don't have street smarts, and that is going to be something that's preyed upon by many people who are street savvy. And this is, that old saying, the meek will inherit the earth, the first will be last, the last will be first. That could be interpreted in a lot of ways. But in a lot of ways, I think what it means is that people who are getting fat, living high on the hog right now, who don't have to rely on these Darwinian instincts, okay? So this is a great example right here, right? So imagine you're somebody who's really overweight, all right? And you've been living high on the hog here in the Gaza Strip. Maybe you're one of the lucky people who had a good job and you are just really overweight. Life has been treating you very well. What are the odds that you're going to be able to get a box of food off this truck? Probably much less so than if you are skinny, you are lean, you are desperate, and you spent your life running from the IDF or whatever the case, right? So this is nature's way of balancing out the equation. It's like, I watched a video of these three wolves, and they were very lean, and there was this one really fat bear, right? This bear had been eating really good that year, but because he was eating so good, he couldn't move quite as fast. So the wolves were able to actually jump the bear because he couldn't move that fast because they were lean. That's just nature's way of balancing things out, okay? So this is what I mean. You fall from the penthouse, it's a lot longer down. A lot of these people, too, have a phenol ties. So many of these people are probably related. I mean, you got to think about, the breeding that's taken place in the Gaza Strip in the last 30 years. I think the population has grown 3 or 4-fold, and this is such a tightly controlled environment. I don't know how they control all the bloodlines, but there's a good chance that you have very extensive family networks and extensive communities that act to mitigate any sort of descent into social chaos that we might see here, where people are typically more alienated and compartmentalized in society, where everybody's just sharing their own apartment and their own place in the suburbs, where they don't know their neighbors. So those extensive family networks create some sort of social cohesion that we're not going to have here, okay? As I indicated, 50% of people here are unemployed. So when Mad Max hits, they roll out of bed and they're like, oh, it's just another day, right? It's just now I'm robbing a food truck instead of, doing whatever else I was doing, waiting for benefits to kick in. 65% are living below the poverty line. These people are totally urbanized, but I'm sure that they probably have those prison-style survival skills. You know what I mean? Where you have to do those little hacks, like how to light a cigarette in jail, use the battery or whatever to light the cigarette. Like little things like that, urban survival skills are probably something that these people can adapt to. Sure, there's an ocean. I don't think they all have a lot of access to it. There's obviously not a lot of nature to retreat to. There's no place to bug out to in the Gaza Strip. It's an open-air prison. It's a very relatively small landmass, I believe about 350 square kilometers. Now that has been cut in half. So we are witnessing one of the greatest case studies for SHTF. I know there was the Bosnian situation, the Serbian situation with Selko, the city that was being bombarded by a year, but I think this is even more intense. And I think it's not a one-to-one comparison for all the reasons I mentioned, but it is something that is going to be studied for decades, if not centuries, as to how people were able to survive under these conditions. And I mean, you could even go back to the concentration camps and how people were able to survive there. You could go back to the Holodomor and, where you did see instances of cannibalism, or the Great Chinese Famine, where you've seen instances of cannibalism. But another thing to consider with this society, the way it's run, is less red tape. You often see, people often criticize when you see these people and they're carrying bodies into the hospital, and it looks like they're just doing it haphazardly. Like there's one guy like holding the shoulder of the guy who's bleeding out, and another guy's grabbing his feet, and it just looks like total chaos to us. Well, I want you to imagine, those streets in India where there's no traffic lights, and it just seems to work because it just works organically. There's that kind of swarm intelligence that happens. The next time you observe a video of a hospital emergent situation in the Gaza Strip or a region in the Middle East where they're accustomed to this kind of bloodshed, just take note of that and look at how everybody moves. Everybody knows their location. Just like those Indian drivers who don't rely on traffic lights and in fact probably would make it even more chaotic. Now there's a lot of accidents there, don't get me wrong, but it's because they're not so bound by that over-regulation that we are accustomed to in our society, is that they are free to kind of do things without having all those self-imposed restrictions that in some ways allow things to flow more smooth, but it also really slows you down, okay? Because we hyper-obsess about all the minutia in our society because we're so over-regulated and we're all accustomed to all this red tape and regulations. You know, you got to change one thing in the urban developers need to change one thing, it's got to go through 10 different people. You know, in this kind of environment, you just do it, right? And for better or for worse, in a survival situation, that sort of get her done attitude can come in handy. So these are things that you need to consider. Now, we're going to be releasing a video in the next few days that talks about building your own strategic reserves, because the government does this, okay? The government has strategic oil reserves. The government has strategic medicine reserves. Many governments have strategic grain reserves. They have reservoirs for water. They have strategic military ammunition reserves. We're going to talk about building your own strategic reserves to potentially safeguard against a situation like this. But leave me your comments in the comment section below about how you think our society would differ if such a situation unfolded. Now, this is a very unique set of circumstances where people are bound to the city. Okay, so there's going to be, and this is why it is such a rare glimpse into what might happen, unfortunately at the expense of these people suffering. But I think we owe it to them to at least take a look at this and try to extrapolate it and see what we can learn from this situation about urban survival, because this is it, okay? Now, I look forward to actually having somebody on the channel who survives this, and so they can talk a bit about their experiences, because I think that would be very useful for people. Now, this is another video here that kind of just shows the chaos that is currently unfolding there. But in the chaos, there's a flow to it. And again, just try to look at this through the eyes of traffic, Indian traffic, Bombay traffic at rush hour, okay? Everybody just kind of, you know, does their thing and they just kind of go with the flow. Nobody is really standing out. Everybody is super gray man. That's one thing you notice, is that there's not a lot of tactical guys standing out like a sore thumb. Like, everybody just kind of blends in. And I think there's a lesson here to be learned somewhere in terms of, you know, just maintaining a gray man status and, you know, people just surviving together. Even how that car just cut that guy off, but, you know, it wasn't a huge deal. It wasn't like a big public freak out or anything. Okay, so this is a map by Schizo Intel, and I gotta let you guys know the coupon code for freeze-dry wholesale foods, 20% off, expires, I believe it expires in the next 12 hours. I think I asked Steve to keep it on till tomorrow at midnight. Steve is the owner of Freeze Dry Wholesale. He makes this kind of stuff for the military, MREs, and all that stuff. Just tons and tons of food. And I could have a whole conversation right now about the supply chain. I was made aware of some more information today, and needless to say, it does not look good. Our supply chain is in shambles. Most people don't even realize it, but we'll leave that for another day. But go and capitalize on that. Stock up while you can, because food is one of the best investments that you can make at this point in time. Now, This is a map that was put together by Schizo Intel. All of these ships are in the Middle East right now. They have their corresponding number, and then you could see which specific ship. So go and check out this map if you want a detailed explanation of just how many US warships are in this region right now. And you really have to ask yourself why, okay? Well, I think we know why. I think we know that they're setting the groundwork for a much larger military campaign, which is why I personally don't buy the false dichotomy which were being presented with Joe Biden being at odds with the Israeli government about going to war with Hezbollah. I don't really buy that, because I think that if that was true, we would not be enabling that sort of behavior by bringing every single warship that we have out to sea that's not currently in repair. 8 out of 11 strike carrier groups are currently deployed right now. Not all of them to this region, but a lot of them. So we are enabling it. So if we were serious about Israel not creating a region-wide conflict, then we wouldn't be having such a presence that gave them a license to do that, signaling that we had their back. Anyways, I'm going to keep this video rather short today. This is another infographic that was released by the Institute for the Study of War, Victoria Newland's company, and or she's one of the key board members. Anyway, so take it with a grain of sand. These are all the attacks that have currently taken place on U.S. military bases. We don't know all the details because, of course, the fog of war, right? Where they're going to let us know what they want us to know when it's instrumental towards whatever ends they have in mind. But as you can see, there's been almost 50 attacks in the last few weeks. I'm not sure how much that compares to the baseline. I'm presuming it's a lot more than is typical. And I'm assuming that we can expect a lot worse, especially as the Israelis continue their campaign, which it looks like they're not going to stop, even if there is a deal brokered with Hamas. I think what they're going to end up doing is they're going to get whatever hostages they can, and they're going to continue the campaign. Now, China's holdings of U.S. treasuries continues to dwindle all the way back down to 2011 levels. And this, of course, corresponds to their stockpiling of gold and their hoarding of gold. China is one of the largest producers of gold nowadays, and they're not selling it. They're keeping it for themselves, and they're divesting of U.S. Treasury notes. So that should tell you something. Now, again, this is an interesting story that people should pay attention to. This record fleet of ships heading to, I guess you can't see the whole story on the screen there. Record fleet of ships heading to load oil in the USA keeps growing. There are a record 51 ships headed to the nation's ports over the next 3 months, and about 80% of the vessels are empty, indicating that they intend to pick up cargo in the United States. Most of these are oil super tankers, so these are going to be picking up crude oil. Now, I'm thinking that what they're going to do in order to combat inflation and suppress the price of oil, and I think this is just a theory, this is possibly why the price of oil has been suppressed as it has in spite of all the craziness going on in the Middle East. Well, I suspect that they're going to drain the strategic oil reserve even more. I could be wrong about this, but let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. I think what they're going to do is deplete the oil reserve even more to try to keep calm in the markets, to try to keep inflation down, because there's a strong correlation between the fluctuations in oil price and the month-to-month CPI numbers. So it's very likely that, in fact, the CPI might even be flat, if not down a little bit, when those numbers come out tomorrow, because of the fact that oil price has diminished. Now, is this the reason why? Because the U.S. is selling off its oil in order to keep the price down and combat OPEC. This is just an interesting infographic here. This is the range of North Korea's missiles. If you didn't know, North Korea, it could, I mean, their Hwasong F-18 can go all the way to Brazil, it looks like. So that's a 15,000 kilometer range. They only need 10,000 range to cover half of the United States in order to get the eastern seaboard. They need their Hwasong 15, which is a 13,000 kilometer range. And we're going to be speaking with a new up-and-coming, I shouldn't say up-and-coming, he's been doing this for a while, but he's a part of the EMP task force. But he has some interesting takes on it and hopefully present us with some new information. We've interviewed NASA engineers, we've interviewed experts in the field of electromagnetic pulse effects, but I'm going to be asking him some questions about modern electromagnetic pulse weapons, because he has some theories about nuclear war that are rather non-conventional, and I'm going to challenge him on those theories and just try to figure out how much of a threat this actually is. Because, of course, North Korea has the capability to throw up a nuclear weapon, and anybody who can do that, they can detonate it at a high altitude. An electromagnetic pulse will theoretically, anyways, I say theoretically because I do think that some of the threats have been just slightly exaggerated, could black out the entirety of the US power grid and lead to the deaths of quite possibly upwards of 90% of the population. This is an interesting statistic. According to satellite data, this has not been confirmed, nor will it ever be, by the Israeli government. 23% of the 383 Israeli armored vehicles that entered the Gaza Strip upon the invasion apparently were destroyed in 5 days. Now, I guess they're basing this on the fact that these vehicles are no longer present in the area, or they've been perceived to be damaged via satellite imagery. I think it's important to discern damage from destroyed, because, of course, a lot of these anti-tank missiles, there is a system on a lot of the Merkava tanks that I believe it like shoots out a projectile when it anticipates that there's a rocket coming towards it. I think, don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure that they have that technology on there. And I think a lot of the explosions that you see are just that. So, I mean, if these guys were smart, they would be doing a double tap, right? And you're not seeing a lot of Merkavas burn in the same way that you were seeing Leopards burn when the Russians were lighting them up, which is an indication that maybe they're being damaged. I'm guessing there's a lot of casualties on the IDF side, and probably more than they're willing to disclose. And I think what we're going to see is we're seeing something similar unfold that we've seen in Russia, whereas their initial maneuvers, because they had that element of surprise, because they were on the initiative, were very fast, okay? And they took territory relatively fast, as they have been throughout the Gaza Strip, albeit all on the periphery and in the regions where Hamas essentially isn't. Now, they have begun to make some headway into the outskirts of the city where the hospital is on the coastline, but it's yet to be seen how they fare going deeper into the city. And they have a lot of work to do. I would say that only 10% of the mission is done, which is concerning considering all of the unrest that's already drummed up. And if we're only 10% of the way through this, and this thing drags on for a year or 2 years, then what's likely going to happen is people are going to, number one, they're going to tire of the issue. And you're already starting to see a bit of fatigue on the issue. And then the war is probably going to, the focus is going to transfer to Hezbollah in the north. And perhaps that's what they want. Because when you really think about it, if you're looking at a humanitarian crisis unfolding, if you want to take attention away, starting another war with Hezbollah, as costly as it will be, it will take attention away from what is going on in the Gaza Strip, because it's probably going to be a much more intense conflict. You're going to see a lot more lives lost. Hezbollah has the capability and the technology to give the IDF a much harder time than Hamas would. So it's very likely that the international focus would shift to that region. Then, of course, a broader war in the Middle East flares up, and then people just forget about the Gaza Strip. So, hopefully the Machiavellian agenda is not that, and they're just going to try to come to some conciliatory solution to this problem. But, you know, as much as I want to be hopeful about that, I cannot see a situation where they allow Hamas to persist. Now, we might just get a name change, and there might be some sort of high-level agreement that Hamas changes its name, and then, you know, Netanyahu can call it a win, and then, you know, they'll slowly manifest as some other organization down the road. But I can't see the Israeli population going for that. As much as they're divided on this issue, as much as there's protests to support the Palestinians inside of Israel, I just can't see the Netanyahu government letting this go so easy. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. We got some great content coming up in the coming weeks ahead. I've been sitting on a lot of videos. We're going to start releasing those, hopefully, as things begin to calm down. I'm not holding my breath on that, but, you know, we're just one black swan away from, you know, people getting in a tizzy all over again. So let's just keep our fingers crossed that we can get a little bit of normalcy in the run-up to the holiday season here, but it doesn't look like it. I mean, I'm trying to be optimistic, guys, but I'm really not. You know what? I'm going to do you guys a favor. There's some guy that's been bugging me. Take that sticker off your hat. You know why I don't take the sticker off my hat? I got this hat for free from the Canadian Coalition for Firearms Rights because I'm too damn busy. And I quite frankly don't give a shit. But there you go, Mr. OCD. Look at that. There's probably a mark left there now. So the sticker is off the hat. We're entering a new era. The stickerless hat. All right, guys. Take care. Stay safe and keep on prepping. Canadian Prepper out.